Many thanks for joining us here on News Desk. We can start off with the very first one. And the flag bearer of the opposition New Patriotic Party on Monday relayed the perception of where Ghana finds itself now. The speech, which Nana Akufo-Addo describes as the true state of the nation, is aimed at countering the constitutionally mandated address delivered by President Mahama last Thursday. Nana Addo, in his address, described Ghana as being in a state of crisis. In just over an hour, and without people to serve as evidence of his submissions, the opposition leader gave a blistering account of where the president's speech fell short of expectation.
I joined the president to celebrate with his 16 success stories. Unfortunately, their stories do not constitute the reality that is present-day Ghana.
Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo addressed a packed auditorium at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, giving them what he regards as the true state of the nation. The NPP flag bearer did not mince words when he spoke about the economy, which has been classified as being in a state of high debt distress.
Ghana is where it is today because reckless borrowing by an incompetent government has led to unsustainable debt levels, which have effectively closed the fiscal space for capital investments. Government has increased the debt stock from 9.5 billion Ghana cedis in 2008 to some 99 billion cedis currently. In dollar terms, this NDC government has therefore borrowed some 37 billion United States dollars in 7 years.
Nana Addo also cast aspersions on claims that power supply has remarkably improved.
The current 800 megawatts, which the president speaks of, is today delivered by emergency power plants, which are costing the consumers a fortune. They are not a permanent solution to our power generation challenge. The government has failed to deliver on its promise. As a result of these questionable deals, electricity tariffs have been increased to exorbitant levels. Consumers are now faced with vanishing power credits and illegal charges for electricity. The president wants to give him credit for resolving DUMSO, which was caused by economic and financial mismanagement of his own government. So how can you expect credit for resolving a problem that you have caused, which has inflicted such a high cost on the nation?
Then, the two-time presidential contender turned his attention to those areas he felt President Mahama had unjustifiably ignored in his State of the Nation's address.
I cannot recall in recent times anything that has so agitated Ghanaians as the importation of the 2 Guantanamo ex-detainees into our country. And yet the president, in his State of the Nation address, chose to dismiss this issue by claiming that his foreign minister had addressed the subject when she appeared before a closed-door session of Parliament, when in fact she did not shed any light on the matter. The president chose to ignore the widespread genuine anxiety amongst our people, in much the same way as he chose to ignore the laws of the land in negotiating the agreement with the U.S. government.
He also clearly stated that the opposition party will not support the Interception of Telecommunications Postal and Packets Bill, which has also been dubbed as the Spy Bill.
Essentially, this bill gives the state unfettered discretionary access to the private correspondence of individuals. It poses potentially a major threat to individual freedom of expression and privacy. This law should not be passed, and the minority has already signaled its opposition to the bill in Parliament. The irony is that the Right to Information Bill, which on the other hand will rather enhance individual freedoms and good governance by providing further access to public information, all in the spirit of transparency and accountability, has rather been put on the back burner.
Meanwhile, the spokesperson on finance for the NPP wants the governor of the Bank of Ghana to step down in the wake of the microfinance meltdown and collapse of DKM.
If I were the governor, I would have stepped down. if I were the governor. Because for the president to come to public, you see, the central bank's mystery is just that we must have confidence. But if our president comes publicly and says, you didn't do a good job, you shouldn't wait to be fired. You should go.
And indeed, we are told that the ruling National Democratic Congress is this morning holding a media briefing to respond to some of the things put across by the NPP flag bearer, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. And you did hear Nana Addo in his closing submission in that very package speak of the right to information bill. Well, this morning, your super station, Joy 99.7 FM, is bringing you a forum on that particular, on the right to information bill, and it's currently happening live now at the Alisa Hotel. Let's cross over to the Alisa Hotel and bring you a live feed of that very forum.
Your question. These laws are limited in their scope. I'm talking about the Anti-Terrorism Act and the Narcotics, Drugs Control, Enforcement and Sanctions Act. They are very limited in their scope. In fact, what the bill seeks to achieve is to cure the inherent deficiencies in those two existing legislation, because the scope of interception has not been laid out in detail so as to put the parameters within which lawful interception can be done within the context that would be directly in consonance with Article 18, so that you do not interfere with the right to privacy of individuals if it is not for the specific reason of detecting crime and preventing it as well. And so the bill, the Interception of Postal Packets and Telecommunication Messages bill, seeks to expand the scope. And like I said, I mean, in the Anti-Terrorism Act, it is very specific. It is specific to terrorism, acts of terrorism. The provisions in the narcotics law is very specific to the enforcement of our laws in relation to narcotics. What this bill seeks to do is to expand the scope to include other criminal acts like suppressing organized crime. And organized crimes here would include money laundering, terrorism, of course, narcotics trafficking, identity theft, and generally for the protection of national security. So this bill gives us an expanded scope of what is already in existence.
Let's interrogate this expanded scope you're talking about and how that sits with international best practices. Let's hear from William Nyako. He's an international lawyer and executive director of US-based Africa Center for International Law and Accountability. Now, there's this argument that the world has suddenly traded its freedom for safety, and that the state the world over, especially since 9/11, 2001, the Americans did have their Patriot Act, and then there was also the Anti-Terrorism Act in the UK. All of these seeking to provide the necessary safety measures, for state. The provisions within this proposed bill, how does that compare to what else is being done around the world?
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. Some may know that from my background, I used to be an investigative journalist with the Ghanaian Chronicle newspaper. It's good to be here and to contribute to this important discussion. From the outset, also, I'd like to say that I take no sides in this important discussion. My role is to provide comparative analysis to what this important bill seeks to do. International best practice actually favors legislation where none exist. In fact, the UN Special Rapporteur's report to UN General Assembly, Frank Rule, indicated that given the tension between right to privacy and rising crime and terrorism, countries that do not have legislation should put in place legislation, but should ensure that the legislation is proportional to the objectives that it seeks to do, and that there should be judicial oversight, and we'll get into the details. Also, of course, privacy is a huge issue when it comes to our rights, because it's fundamental. It's a fundamental human right. Ghana has obligations not only in Ghana, but also on the African continent. Ghana has ratified the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Article 9 provides for the right to privacy, but also derogates it to a point where it also says that's subject to existing laws in countries. Also, at the international level, Ghana has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Civil and Political ICCPR, especially Article 17, provides for the privacy of communications, of correspondence, that individuals' right to communications shall not be interfered with by the state. But as with all laws, you have a broad spectrum, and then if government has to interfere, they are narrowly defined. Ghana, especially also under ICCPR, cannot violate some of these provisions because individuals, Ghanaians, can actually bring a case against the government at that level. Especially also, Ghana has also ratified the provisions, first protocol, which allows individuals to bring cases. Additionally, also, when you go back to the African continent, having ratified the ACHPR, an individual citizen like me in Ghana, I can bring a case against Ghana for violating those rights. Also, the regional systems, including the European Convention, the European Commission has a European Convention on Human Rights. And Article 8.2 also provides for non-interference with correspondence. But again, in all these laws, they go back and derogate that if states must interfere with your correspondence, it must be within the law. And also, the European Commission actually, it goes further, that where there has been a violation of your rights, there should be an effective remedy. And we'll go into that. On the African continent, South Africa had one in 2002. Uganda had its legislation 2010. Zimbabwe has it. Many other African countries have it as well. So the international standard is to have legislation where there's no legislation. But these laws must be narrowly defined because the absence of law gives government unfettered access, actually, to violate your rights without you having recourse to an effective remedy.
Interesting submissions. Just as I go to Kofi Bento, I mean, you raise points that there must be legislation. That there are lots of examples that support an environment that has a certain level of legislation, and also the fact that there's the need for judicial oversight. To my lay mind, there seems to be that oversight already enshrined in laws that we have. For example, Section 100 of the Electronic Communications Act does give sufficient power to the President to issue the required interception by an executive order. Further, Section 98 to 106 in the Electronic Transactions Act 772 of 2008 also provide further provision. Now, this new bill repeals that Section 100 and then proceeds to grant powers to a public officer. To the best of my knowledge, there's no who is a public officer, and this is where the ambiguity creates fear in the minds of people. You're talking about the narrowing of the law. Does this law give you the sense that we've narrowed it enough to ensure that we're not abused as citizens?
Well, I mean, going back to what other countries have done, the UK, for example, it is the Home Secretary that actually provides the authorization, not the President. In Scotland, it's the Secretary of State. In Ireland, it is the Minister of Justice. So I think Ghana, initially, we moved it up to the president. I mean, the president is involved in a number of things, and you really don't want to get the president involved in issues like this. But where, in Ghana's case, we have the National Security Coordinator. It's a little ambiguous. There are options for how you can address this. One of it, obviously, is to have someone who has the people's mandate as a result, not only of an election, nomination, but also approval from Parliament. Because you vote for people to manage your affairs and you hold them accountable. So in some ways, that power has to be subject to somebody who is also subjected to, the citizens. We can expand further on this, but I will present options as to how this can be addressed. But in Ireland, this is the Minister of Justice. In the UK, it's the Home Secretary. In Scotland, it's the Secretary of State. So there are various ways. But I also must say that even when we talk about international standards, we should also look at our specific circumstances. In many countries, sometimes countries face different levels of threats. And depending on what they seek to do, you might have more permissive intrusions or less permissive intrusions. I mean, in the US, we have lots of wiretaps. And way back, laws were enacted. To some extent, the FBI actually has the ability to really directly take information from service providers. So is the international best practice is a good thing to look at, but you have to specifically situate it in your environment to see whether the levels of threats that you face are, proportional to the action that you seek. We should not expect Israel, for example, to have a more, feeble laws when, daily occurrences are there. So international best practice is good, but it also must be situated into. There is a link between right to privacy as well as right to information. Okay, the two are linked in the sense that if somebody needs to have the ability to communicate, to receive and to send information, the person must have that right enshrined by law. So really, when you talk about this law, you also want to do a segue into people's right to freedom of speech and expression, which is guaranteed by a right to information or freedom of information. In all of these countries that these best practices are coming from, especially in European modern developed countries, there is a component part of a right to information within their bills, within their laws. So it follows, that one gives birth to the other, others are, intricately linked. And so this is very important. And I'll give you a personal example. In the US, we have a freedom of information bill. A while back, the FBI declassified information that they had on Ghana's late president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, for example. And I wrote to the FBI using the FOI and actually got information about taps that they had done on President Nkrumah, letters from the FBI, including opening his mails when he was in school in the 1930s, and opening his postage, and then after that sending it back to the sender, and the sender doesn't know, the receiver doesn't know that it was done. So, but they have the framework for providing information to you, and Ghana's bill is deficient in some respects, and we will talk about it. It's a good start, but we can improve on it.
Certainly. Now, quick